Hello and welcome to Make It Conscious. This is episode 2 of the Make It Conscious podcast series. Today we're going to be carrying on with the same theme from last week. That is, we're going to be exploring the question, what is spirituality? I'm aware that there is a great deal of confusion and disagreement over what spirituality actually is, and yet it is widely agreed on by many that spirituality is a vital part of our lives and in solving the problems that we have. In the previous podcast, I made the case that all of our challenges can be construed as spiritual challenges on some level. And I talked about this from the perspective of the idealist paradigm. So that means understanding that what we experience is our own mind. And so I made the case that materialism, standing in opposition to idealism, that actually is the source of many of our problems and challenges personally, in our organizations, and certainly in our society as a whole, because it confuses what's really important. It confuses the symbol of things like our contribution, our economic energy, love and relationships. It confuses the symbols and representations of these things for the real thing. And so by falling in love with the number of likes we have on Instagram, for example, we actually cheat on what that thing ostensibly represents, which is our own value as a human being, for example, our own genuine growth and advancement, our own maturity and evolution, and our ability to ultimately contribute to other people from that place. So that's a bit of a dense intro. In this session, I'm going to follow on from the points I made last time, where I talked about what materialism really misses when it comes to spirituality. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about what religion misses when it comes to spiritual growth. Because I think the common way of approaching spiritual growth in this day and age certainly has been through religion, right? And that's gradually waned over the last 150 years in the West, as we'll see in a moment. But in its place, there have been many things that have propped up, right? New Age spirituality, pop spirituality, essentially rehashes of a very similar thing, whereby people are still chasing something that looks like spirituality because we all have this inner drive for wholeness. But within our materialist world, perhaps actually, again, we've just gone out of the frying pan into the fire and found a new surrogate for something that merely looks the part, but maybe isn't quite the real thing. And so in the previous episode, I actually made the case that in its most concise possible form, spiritual growth is the process of making the unconscious conscious. And it's important for us to understand that there is such a thing as the unconscious. Not best described as a thing per se, but as a concept and a notion that there's a lot that we're not aware of, and there is this field of potential and mind, which we call the unconscious, that becomes realized through our conscious experience. And that spirituality is a way of becoming more conscious. And that means becoming more free, having more control over our own minds and lives, and actually connecting with the deepest parts of ourselves, and therefore reducing inner conflict, therefore suffering less, to the degree where life just becomes very smooth and easy. And a lot of people find this through religion, right? If you encounter very devoted religious people, they are often very, very peaceful people. And they have a huge amount of value from their religion. And they manage to reduce their own inner conflict greatly through their beliefs, through their practice, and through their mental discipline. And we'll talk about why that is. And that can certainly take an individual to a point. And that may be as far as they need to go for their own welfare. But it does also set up a tremendous trap if and when they come to be betrayed, say, by a spiritual leader, or symbols they've fallen in love with and come to believe are the point of what they're practicing, come to be seen as not the real thing. And it would also mean, therefore, that unless there's a genuine acceptance and a genuine integration of unconscious content, other people who have come to similar beliefs, except via a different path, a different religion, for example, where's the communion with these other people, right? How is that in any way conducive to wholeness, especially as we move towards a globally integrated society? That kind of belief system is going to become less and less tenable without a serious injection of energy in the name of mere tolerance. Well, I think to move to a truly integrated global society, tolerance is all good and well, but acceptance and understanding are way superior. So that's where we want to get to. And as part of that, we're going to be understanding what traditional religion actually misses about spiritual growth, why it can only take a person so far, and why, therefore, true understanding of the principles of spiritual growth are necessary for us to move on from that point, whether as individuals or in society as a whole, as the critical mass of consciousness development moves forward. So there are great numbers of people who have, for want of a better phrase, moved beyond religion as it's traditionally configured in its very absolutist sense. And this was a natural progression because as we started to understand the way our material experience operates more and more from the Enlightenment onwards, so like the late 1600s onwards, the truth of religion in that absolutist sense had to be called into question. Right? It was just very hard to maintain a literal interpretation of many religious texts in light of what was being discovered about our experience and about our environment. And so that has brought about a very perhaps entrepreneurial and driven, enterprising state of consciousness, which we see in the motivation of people to, create a good life for themselves, to manipulate external realities and create a more comfortable existence through that endeavor. But then what that misses is the consequences of doing that and of focusing on that as the point. And now we have the undeniable results of that in the form of economic turmoil, environmental destruction, codependency in our relationships, pretty much as standard, and misunderstandings around what true love really is as part of that. We have suffering mental health. We have suffering physical health, no doubt, through our perverted food supply and the obsession with things that taste great and are cheap and easy to manufacture, but are just terrible for our bodies. So I discussed all of that at length in the previous episode. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about what religion misses. And in a nutshell, I would describe it as much as it provides people with a way of engaging with their unconscious mind, it does that without necessarily knowing that that is what it's doing. And that spiritual growth, therefore, is the process of making the unconscious conscious. So whilst religion provides people with a means of engaging with their unconscious mind, their inner sage, their inner hero, the self and God, it does that without realizing that actually what people are engaging with is a reflection of their own minds, including the vast expanse that is the unconscious mind and everything that includes. So in this particular episode, I'm going to examine what religion misses about spiritual growth and why organized religion is not the answer to spiritual challenges. And there is certainly a movement right now of influencers and their followings appearing to move back to a kind of absolutist religious stance. Now, this is both beneficial and not beneficial. For some people, this might be where they need to go at this time. For others, this is absolutely a backstep for the reasons I'm going to describe in this episode. There's a lot of people moving in the West to Christianity, finding some answers there. But as Jordan Peterson says, it's not so much about the truth of the Bible, but what it represents, right? That it might actually be truer than true in some respect. And that's closer to where we want to be getting to. But I would put the question to you, over the past 200 years, have people become more religious or less religious? I think most people in the West would probably believe we've become less religious. And in the West, that is demonstrably true. So according to data from Gallup, church membership, including people who attended synagogues and mosques, peaked in the mid-40s, around 75-76% of the US population. And in 2020, it had declined to 47%. So that's clearly a massive drop there. Over the last 30 years or so, when asked how important would you say religion is in your own life, the percentage who answered very important was around 58% in the early 90s, peaked at around 61% in the late 90s, but has since dropped to 48 or 49%. In the United Kingdom, the percentage of the population who are church members over the last 120 years has dropped substantially, falling from around 33% in 1900 to less than 10% today. However, when we look at the world as a whole, it would appear that the religious population is actually increasing as a percentage of world population. So whilst we're seeing a relative decline in the West actually only accounts for a relatively small portion of world population. And in much of the rest of the world, religiosity is actually increasing. So I've got some data here from Christianity in View. They say that in 200 years, that is from 1800 to 2000, whilst the world population increased more than 6 times, the Christian population increased 9 times. So there's a 50% relative increase in Christianity. But also, with Islam, it was even more. So the fastest growing religion today in the world is Islam. And I've got a chart here for those that can't see. It looks as though both Christianity and Islam are growing at approximately the same rate for the last 50 years or so. But today, Islam is the fastest growing. I was skeptical of that source, however, and I decided to do some further research with the help of AI. So just as a side note, I was using ChatGPT to find the actual data on this from reliable sources. And it did confirm that religiosity is increasing in many parts of the world, particularly Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Christians in sub-Saharan Africa are projected to nearly double from 531 million in 2010 to more than 1 billion in 2050. Islam will grow faster than any other major religion, with a 73% increase between 2010 and 2050, and the source for that information is the Pew Research Center. On the other hand, non-religious population is increasing in Western Europe, as should be no surprise to any of us. A report in 2018 found that 55% of UK adults considered themselves to have no religion. So clearly there is a Western and rest of world divide here, with the Western world becoming far less religious, at least in terms of organized religion, whilst Africa, Asia, and the Middle East are all becoming significantly more religious at the moment. I would doubt these current projections as to whether they're actually going to hold. And the reason is that what I think is happening here, it's not that the West is devolving spiritually. It's that actually what's happened is they have been evolving, as has the entire world. But as they've evolved, it's brought on new challenges. So as we have thrown out religion because it has become very pervious to modern science, its misunderstanding of the unconscious mind is precisely what has made it pervious to modern science. But at the same time, in pursuing this materialist paradigm, trying to create the good life for ourselves through economic growth, through technology and science, we've actually brought on a host of new problems that reject all the things that religion actually used to help with. So we've essentially thrown the baby out with the bathwater. So whilst organized religion membership has gone down, a need for genuine spirituality has certainly appeared. And this is not a bad thing. This is not devolution. This is a natural progression of consciousness. It's like a pendulum swing going from one extreme to the next, trying to find that middle slowly over time. So we've gone from extreme religiosity, perhaps 200 years ago, to extreme agnosticism or even atheism. And that has brought about its own host of problems, because the truth is that not everything that religion stood for was just some superstitious fairy tale that was completely false and had to be thrown out. There's actually a lot to it that we would do well to consider. And it really comes down to engaging with our unconscious mind and becoming more conscious. So, fundamental to the spiritual growth journey beyond a point is, again, like I said, understanding that there is this unconscious mind, and that not everything is as it seems. We have this conscious ego that's telling us a story about who we are and how the world is and what's really going on. But actually, the unconscious mind is doing a lot of the work behind the scenes and is operating without our conscious awareness. Meanwhile, our conscious awareness is sort of telling us a story and presenting an appearance of something that's coherent and making sense. But there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. So it's really important we understand this, not just as individuals, but societally, like to really understand there is this unconscious mind and it's playing a major role in everything that is unfolding, not least our own suffering as individuals, but also the path to finding meaning, right? It comes from the same place. So religion is growing worldwide, but declining in the West. And how people practice spirituality has changed drastically. And where it meets with a modern consciousness, this creates new challenges for attaining spiritual self-sovereignty. So essentially, organized religion and what I would call pop spirituality are spirituality materialized. So we all have a drive towards wholeness. It's what is driving our actions ultimately all the time. But it's possible for us to get caught up in materialism and come to believe that the material world is really what we're striving for. And so therefore, with our innate drive to wholeness and with our innate drive to uncover the deepest aspects of ourselves, things like materialist religion and pop spirituality appear because they look like just what the mind needs in order to become whole, right? They have the right rituals, the right clothing, the right way of talking, the right way of presenting yourself, the right beliefs, the right book, and so on. But these are actually material representations of a much deeper truth that cannot truly be materialized. And this is fundamental to why organized religion, and I would include pop spirituality within that, simply cannot be the long-term solution to any of our challenges. They can only take us to a certain point, approximately the point at which they start to cause more challenges than they actually solve. And so many people have moved beyond that point and have been moving beyond that point for quite some time. And this is not, by the way, to criticize anybody who still follows an organized religion. I know many, and many of the ones I happen to know are actually practicing their own religion in a non-absolutist way. So they may be Christian, but they actually have a degree of their own self-sovereignty they can use to take and leave aspects of their religion and assess them with their own discernment and understand what it really means. So there may be aspects of literal absolutism still left in there, but it's the fact they're able to say, okay, it's not so much that Jesus was the original savior, but actually that he represents something, that he actually is the great example, to quote Carl Jung, not the great exception. So speaking of Jung, here's another quote from Carl Jung. He said that the various forms of religion no longer appear to the modern man to come from within, to be expressions of his own psychic life. For him, they are classed with the things of the outer world. So this is very much in line with what we were talking about. Jung, in his extensive research, certainly believed that prior to organized religion, human spirituality was not a material one. It was based in an interaction, a participation with the environment. So it wasn't assumed, for instance, that any spiritual mystical experience that they had was a product of something they encountered in the world, or configuring their world just the right way, or doing just the right ritual, or being in just the right place, so much as it was an interplay between themselves and the environment, and there was very little perceived separation between the two. But what I believe is, as part of humans' natural consciousness evolution, we've had to have this materialist phase to learn from it, to learn what's useful from it, but also to learn what is worth throwing out from it as well. Bearing in mind that Jung died in 1961, I'm not sure when he said this, but clearly he was talking about the 20th century and how at that time the various forms of religion appeared to be things of the outer world. And Jung actually believed that this was a fundamental reason for the neuroses in society and what he was looking to help resolve in his patients. Now to a famous quote from Nietzsche on a similar tip. He says, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Yet his shadow still looms. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves?" Now, the good news is God isn't dead. But the point made by Nietzsche is that in practical terms, it was as though we had killed God. We had dispelled a belief of God. And I think we're getting to the point of trying to understand the middle here in that, okay, are we really believing in a personified God, like a man that lives in the clouds, to use that old cliche? Or is it a complete absence of God? No, there is no man in the clouds, so that can't be right. But maybe there is, something in between that actually may represent some kind of truth. But again, God, in a sense, is part of our minds. On one level, God is a concept. It's an aspiration. It's a symbol of our highest possible potential. And so without that aspiration, what are we even aspiring towards? Because if it's not God, it can't be good, right? If it's not God, if it's not the highest possible good, then it can only take us somewhere that's not the highest possible good. And that is a place of hubris and, again, trying to control the world and thinking that we can just make it perfect, despite being completely surrounded by a level of engineering in nature that is just orders of magnitude beyond what we can even hope to achieve ourselves. So Nietzsche really making the point that in doing away with our highest possible ideal, what are we to do now? Who's going to come save us now? How can we possibly save ourselves without an idea of God? Jung again underscores this. He says, "The modern man has lost all the metaphysical certainties of his medieval brother and set up in their place the ideals of material security, general welfare, and humaneness. But it takes more than an ordinary dose of optimism to make it appear that these ideals are still unshaken." So as much as our medieval ancestors may not strictly have been correct or accurate in their beliefs, during the time in which they lived, there were certainly some pretty useful beliefs. And they were true enough to navigate the complexities that they faced in those days. But they certainly don't work today. And that's why we've been forced really to move on from those metaphysical beliefs. They're no longer certain. But in their place, we've tried to patch up the world, tried to create systems and structures, tried to agree on fixed values as a way to compensate really for our inner uncertainty. But it should be quite clear to everybody that these systems and structures are anything but stable. So we find ourselves in a bit of a predicament. None of us remembers choosing to be alive, right? And yet here we are, experiencing joy and sadness, meaning and suffering, without any guide or instruction manual, right? Saying, okay, here's why you're here, and here's what you do as a human. So what a predicament, right? We know we need to do something, because if we don't, we suffer and we die, but we don't know exactly what it is for us to do, right? So that is the thing we're all trying to figure out. And all religions and spiritual traditions ostensibly serve as a vehicle for navigating this predicament. And it is indeed the process of becoming more conscious. And all of these traditions provide a method and a way of life for spiritual growth, and a means of engaging with our unconscious mind. And in doing all of this, they provide a source of meaning as an antidote to the otherwise ineradicable suffering that accompanies life. So it's really like finding our grounding, right? A spiritual practice really helps us find our grounding, helps us unify our minds around a kind of purpose. Right? If we know what we're doing, why we're doing it, that does a lot to mitigate against any kind of existential dread. Without that, what are we really even chasing? But religions, like all things in life, can be both a vehicle for our spiritual growth and a trap. And our modern understanding of the unconscious mind can explain exactly how religions have become traps. This does not mean that we ought to throw out everything religion stands for. There are common elements to all religions that do genuinely serve to advance consciousness to a point. There is a lot we can learn from observing what works to improve the state of a person's mind, whilst using modern psychology to understand why it works. And if you look at any spiritual path or religion, they tend to be concerned with three primary cornerstones of practice. And I'll break those down into understanding or wisdom, conduct, and mental discipline. So the first being understanding or wisdom. This is really about coming to a model of existence and our own minds, grounding ourselves with that map and understanding what progress along the journey actually consists of. So you can think of this as kind of like the map for navigating life. And with enough spiritual practice of all three of these cornerstones, it's possible for the map then to become the territory itself. But that's a hurdle that most religions can't really facilitate if practiced to a T. I mean, what they practice can certainly facilitate that process, but it takes the individual to take a leap and go, hang on a second, I'm no longer getting the literal interpretation of this because I've experienced something that doesn't quite match the literal. And so at some point, the map has to be let go of for the territory to present itself. The second cornerstone of any religion or spiritual practice is conduct. So this is how we engage with the world, how we condition the world around us and our minds through our behavior. So this is how we speak to other people, speaking in a way that is wholesome and conducive to wholeness of mind, being kind, speaking the truth, not being harsh or aggressive. This also relates to our livelihood, right? It's about how we contribute to existence and contribute our own economic energy so that we can also justifiably receive what we need in return. And it's also about how we engage with temptations and the substances of the world, right? How we manage our own impulses. So these are all aspects of conduct. And thirdly, mental discipline. Every spiritual tradition has a mental discipline component. In Islam, for example, this is practiced very actively. They pray 5 times a day. I used to think that was excessive before I really started practicing mental discipline myself. And as I started meditating, which at times I've had periods where I was meditating several times a day, I really came to understand the benefit of that frequent and regular check-in and connection to something beyond yourself. But it's also really about mental training. It's about that dedicated practice of making the unconscious conscious, so the mind is not being torn every which way by disparate desires that reside in the unconscious mind, but these things are given the space to rise to the surface where they can be seen in consciousness, and then a decision can be made as to what to do with them, to let them go, to see them through, let them run their course. So mental discipline includes managing our mental state using energy, preventing unwholesome states of mind, anger and aggression, these kinds of things, cultivating wholesome states of mind, kindness, compassion, and so on. It also involves mindfulness, that's present moment awareness, noticing what is going on moment to moment. And it also always includes a dedicated form of practice, whether that's meditation, whether that's prayer, even active imagination in the Jungian style, I would consider to be a very powerful form of mental discipline. So all religions and spiritual practices seem to work, right? They seem to produce results in a person following them. But why do they really work? Well, if we are sticking to an absolutist religious perspective, then we might explain the benefits in symbolic terms pertaining to our religion. So we'd be forced to explain the benefits to our life and mind in terms of, say, we're experiencing the grace of God, or maybe we have good karma. And so for a Buddhist who's talking about good karma and a Christian who's talking about the grace of God, neither of them can really be said to be wrong, except that those claims appear to be incommensurate with each other. So about prayer, a Christian might say they're talking to God, or sending prayers or love to those in need. Now, if it's useful to think of it in those terms, that's totally conducive to wholeness and spiritual growth to a point. But is it really the most accurate and therefore the most useful way to describe what is going on here? Challenges arise when we do not realize that we are engaging with the symbols and not the deeper reality, when we misappropriate symbols and language for the real lived experience. So the symbols themselves, the grace of God, the karma, sending love to those in need, and so on, these are not the real thing, but they are a way of connecting with the real thing. So we might come to explain what we are doing in terms of the symbols and mistake the symbols for the point. We arrive at some idea of what produces favorable results for us, but can only explain the why in terms of the interactions of the various symbols. The more we become attached to mere symbols of spirituality, the more we disconnect from the real thing, and the more the what seems to deviate from the actual why, and the more conflict starts to creep into our own mind and between groups. And hence why we have conflict between groups of spiritual practitioners and religions who both appear to teach the values of kindness and treating each other as you would treat yourself and so on. But for this conflict cannot be consistently kind to each other. And it's because they've mistaken the symbol for the real thing. So it's not about doing what God wants per se. It's not about not upsetting God, for example. It's about conducting oneself in a way that is conducive to wholeness of mind, to living without conflict, to making the unconscious conscious. So if we are to follow a religion in an absolutist sense, we risk, in short, coming to believe that it is about being a certain way rather than simply living without conflict. And ultimately, that is what spiritual self-sovereignty is about. It's about reaching a point where you can live without conflict, where you've straightened out all the various conflicts in your own mind and are suffering substantially less as a result of that. Now, one might counter this and say, but if you're just living without conflict, doesn't that just mean doing what you want and going around and stealing from people and hurting people and so on? Like, hey, no conflict, just go and do anything, go commit crimes and harm people. No, and here's why. Because if we were to conduct ourselves in that way and condition the world in that way, we're going to experience the results of that. We're going to condition our own mind. We're going to create conflict in our own mind, because it's actually impossible for us to, say, going around stealing from other people, harming other people, and then experience an existence where that doesn't also happen to us. And again, this harks back to the idealist paradigm, which I discussed in the previous episode, where actually what we are experiencing is our own mind. So if we see ourselves going around harming others, then our own mind will create situations where we end up becoming harmed in a similar and or proportionate and commensurate way. Jung said that the whole point of Jesus' life was not that we should become exactly like him, but that we should become ourselves in the same way that he became himself. Jesus was not the great exception, but the great example. Now, there are, of course, many qualities that Jesus exemplified, which are aspects of our character that we need to integrate. So the kindness and so on. And anyone walking the spiritual path will practice these things, because it's not that these are aspects of personality per se, or that we are inherently kind and other people aren't, but that actually kindness is a product of a mind that is integrated, and it's also a way of moving the mind towards integration. But it doesn't necessarily mean that anyone who individuates the way that Jesus is said to have done would necessarily live Jesus's life. Like, they wouldn't necessarily start a new spiritual tradition, for example, or a religion. They might just carry on with their job in a normal way. It's not about becoming Jesus. It's about becoming yourself. And becoming yourself does involve being kind. It does involve integrating aspects of yourself that would have compelled you otherwise to be aggressive or hostile or act impulsively. So in that sense, even though Jesus was the great example, not the great exception, there are also commonalities to what he taught that we can all embody in our own individuation journey. So religions provide a framework that brings a person's mind closer to a state of wholeness. They work to reduce inner conflict in the individual by giving them a way to engage with their unconscious mind, their true selves, the whole beyond the ego, and a sense of purpose to unify their minds around. This is what religion really does, right? This is what spiritual practice actually does. It's not about talking to God per se. It's not about appeasing the spirits or anything like this. It's ultimately a way of making the unconscious conscious. That is what spiritual growth is. So even by practicing a few basic spiritual tenets like speaking honestly and practicing generosity, you can greatly improve the quality or the state of your mind, rather, and your lived experience. So you take any one of these little pieces of spiritual practice. I compile these in the 7 Habits of Individuation. That's a modality that I use, and you can download my audio program on that at makeitconscious.com. The 7 habits there, which I have compiled as a way to encapsulate all of the salient features that I observe in sages that I've known and people from history, and also from my own spiritual practice. But if you were to take any one of those habits and just commit to absolutely just doing that one habit, or just imagine if everyone in the world did that one habit, man, the world would transform. So, even just practicing a few basic things like committing to only tell the truth, for example, you can improve the state of your mind greatly just through a simple practice like that. So religion and spiritual practices work because they work to make the unconscious conscious, and to the extent that they do the same. But in the absence of an understanding of the unconscious mind, these traditions bring about their own challenges. They may appear to work, and they may produce beneficial results over and over again, but on that basis, you might assume they are the truth. But this is actually fallacious, right? This is actually a kind of, I dare say, an addict mentality, because for someone who, say, gets addicted to a substance like heroin or crack cocaine, they may genuinely believe that that substance is the way to make themselves feel better, but they're actually not resolving the underlying reason that they got hooked on it in the first place. They're merely placating it. And so whilst practicing a religion in most cases hopefully wouldn't be as immediately damaging to a person's life as that, the principle is kind of similar in that just because something appears to placate your suffering, your internal conflicts, that unless it's actually working to resolve the underlying conflict, it's not actually solving the problem, and the problem will inexorably present itself again at some point. And likewise, just because it appears to remedy your suffering doesn't necessarily mean that what it's saying is the truth. And it's quite easy to disprove this, right? Because there's so many different religions that all practice similar principles, but maybe disagree about the sort of surface level symbols, right? Like who the actual savior was and who actually wrote the truth and various little details like this. Well, they can't all be true, right? So they're mistaking the symbols for the real thing again. So unless there is an accounting made within the tradition, within the model itself, to say that the map is not the territory, then any absolutist tradition can only take a person so far in their spiritual journey. In fact, beyond a point, they are likely to land you in some very difficult spiritual traps, because it is inevitable at some point that some kind of conflict is going to emerge. Like on one hand, you're getting so much benefit from this spiritual group or this religion. It's produced so many benefits to your life. You're feeling so much more peaceful. You feel like you've got a real sense of purpose. Oh, but then suddenly your spiritual leader is caught lying, right? Or caught abusing someone. What does that do to the mind, right? And no doubt many of you have experienced that kind of conflict. So that is something that then has to be resolved. It's like, well, if the person who taught me this information is going around lying and abusing people or committing fraud and so on, what does that mean about the words that he taught, the lessons that he ostensibly gave to us? Good luck figuring that out. That's a very difficult challenge that I think many more people are going to have to go through at some point as we loosen our grip on a materialist paradigm and move towards taking responsibility for our own mind. So as part of this, we are encouraged to project our own inner sage onto religious figures, mostly preventing us from realizing it in ourselves. We engage with our unconscious through the world, but we do not realize that what we are experiencing is actually part of us. So this is a process that Jung coined as participation mystique. So this is where we're actually engaging with religious figures or religious symbols or even religious doctrine or even other people, right? Even a lover or a partner or a community in some respect. And we are projecting part of ourselves into the interaction. We don't realize we're doing it. We think we're seeing this amazing person or this spiritual guru, but actually what we're doing is we're projecting our own inner sage archetype and probably other archetypes as well, mother, father, God, and so on, onto this person. So much the same way, they are not the real thing. And in many cases are actually deliberately trying to withdraw that projection from us, get us to engage in participation mystique and give our sovereignty up to them, often because they are a traumatized person or they're trying to repress their own unresolved conflicts. And so participation mystique can be a wonderful thing when it's being done consciously, when you actually know that you are engaging with the objects of the world as a way to relate to your own inner content and what is, right, beyond the ego. But if it's being done unconsciously and you actually think that the person you're engaging with is some kind of savior or God or something, then that can land you in some very difficult and dangerous situations. So this is the thing that religion misses. It misses this piece of the unconscious mind. It doesn't necessarily realize that it is engaging with the unconscious mind. So it is precisely this missing piece of the unconscious mind that has made religion and traditional spiritual practice pervious to modern science. Science just pretty much came in there and had a field day. It was like, what? You think that the earth was made in 7 days? You think it's only 5,500 years old and that this person is actually the one true savior? Get out of here. So like science just had a field day just proving all this stuff to be inaccurate. And it then threw the baby out with the bathwater. So this is an excerpt from my article, Cults and the Unconscious. You can read that on the makeitconscious.com blog. It goes, in mistaking the unreal for the real, religious thought has left itself open to scrutiny by modern science. The advent of science and the reliance on rational thought has done its part to disprove the reality of such symbols, but in doing so has also hubristically thrown out the realness they represented. The chaos this has caused is principally what has led to our modern discovery of the unconscious. New problems call for new solutions that transcend both ways of operating. As damaging as the abandonment of religion and our dissociation from ourselves has been, it brings with it a commensurate, profound opportunity for spiritual growth, based on our new and evolving understanding of the workings of the unconscious mind. Genuine spiritual growth has a place for both rational thought and engagement with the deepest parts of ourselves. So, I'm generally an optimist. I see that there is a progression going on here and that every challenge that is solved presents new challenges. And the solution that comes from that is generally the one that transcends the contradictions of both stages that came prior to it. So where we go from here means integrating the need for both rational thought on one hand, but also the engagement with the deepest parts of ourselves, which means the unconscious mind. If we just try and go around wrangling with the world and forgetting about the mind, as we largely have been doing, we're going to create a lot of problems, not least our own mental conflicts and suffering. So whilst all religions teach the value of renunciation and letting go, None have any reliable way to discern genuine letting go from mere repression. And this is fatal, since the outcome of both can appear to improve the state of your mind, at least in the short term. But only the genuine integration of unconscious contents can lead to lasting freedom. So this is one of the challenges I encountered in the Buddhist cult that I was part of, in that there was really no way to understand whether the practices we were doing were really about letting go, or whether they were really about repression and replacement and placation of those conflicts. Because if they don't have a concept of the unconscious mind, then what even is integration of neuroses and conflicts within one's own mind? We talk about letting go, but what does that really mean, right? So really this understanding of the unconscious mind is absolutely key and fundamental to our understanding of spiritual growth, what we need to understand about spiritual growth and the solutions that we actually need going forward. So what psychologists like Freud and Jung realized is that the cause of all of our suffering and neurosis has its roots in the unconscious, from the disintegrated psyche being unable to meet all of the disparate needs of its conscious and unconscious aspects, and hence being misaligned with itself and the world. What any legitimate spiritual tradition seeks to do is to integrate the psyche, to reduce inner conflict by enabling a relationship with the unconscious. So for all the benefits that religion has brought as an antidote to the suffering of life, it leaves out this vital component, a nuanced understanding of the mind itself, including the notion of an unconscious mind. And invariably, the true sages of religion are those who manage to break beyond the doctrines and the conditioning imposed on them by the short-sighted herd. So clearly Jesus is an example here. He was thought of as quite a maverick, certainly the way he's presented. And Buddha as well. Buddha was coming from the earlier Brahmin tradition and had a number of teachers, but found that he wasn't really getting anywhere with those guys. He was concerned with ascetic practices like starving himself and this kind of stuff. Found out that that wasn't taking him anywhere. So eventually he had to just make the unconscious conscious and figure out a lot of this stuff on his own. Of course, what the practices of these two people led to today shows up in the form of absolutist religion. And there's a great irony there in that both of these people themselves said that, the kingdom of God is within you in the case of Jesus, or be an island unto yourself, as Buddha said, let the Dharma be your teacher. So they're kind of saying, move towards spiritual self-sovereignty. Don't confuse me for the point. Right? I'm just an example, I'm not an exception. So that's always the case with these true sages. It's not those who followed the rules better than anyone else. It's those who actually learn to move and operate dynamically with the world in a way that was living without conflict. And the only way to do that was to attain to spiritual self-sovereignty and find their own way. It's the only way that can work for any of us, because the world is not the point, right? The world is just a reflection of our own minds, ultimately. It comes back to the idealist paradigm. When we start with that as the premise, it's like, how could meeting specification better than anyone else ever be the way to spiritual progress or enlightenment? It can take you to a point, of course, but ultimately, if what we're experiencing is a reflection of our own minds, the only way to reduce our conflict is to work on the mind itself. And then the world will shift and move to a point where it then reflects our minds. So what the true sage seeks to do is to make the unconscious conscious. And the path of individuation is the process of making the unconscious conscious. And this, in a nutshell, is really what religion had missed. So whilst it allows people to engage with the unconscious mind, it doesn't have a concept for the unconscious mind, and it doesn't do that consciously. So for us to move beyond this, it's really about coming to understand the unconscious mind, and that the path of spiritual growth and the solution to many of our challenges is the process of developing consciousness. So I thought I'd end this particular episode by just simply summarizing what I've been saying so far. But I thought I would turn to an AI tool to do the work for me here. So you might have heard of ChatGPT. This is the new AI bot that can basically write essays in a matter of seconds based on whatever criteria you give it. I essentially fed this bot an article on which I based much of today's talk, as well as some other data points around religion and so on, and just asked it to summarize. So here we go. It says, in summary, religiosity is on the rise in many parts of the world, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, but decreasing in the West. Religions can be both a vehicle for growth and a trap. Modern psychology can help us understand how religions have become traps, where they are no longer used as a vehicle for growth, but as a means to power or an obstacle to consciousness development. However, it's worth noting that there are common elements in all religions that genuinely serve to advance consciousness. These common elements are wisdom, conduct, and mental discipline, which are all three parts of the same path. Wisdom is a mental model and attitude that grounds us in experience, helps us make sense of what we are experiencing, and provides a map of how to progress. Conduct is a system of ethics that deals with how to treat other people and creatures and how to engage with the substances and temptations of the world. Mental discipline is prayer, meditation, or other practice of training the mind and connecting with the whole beyond the ego. While many religious practices may be beneficial, it is important to understand the underlying mechanisms behind these practices and to critically evaluate the beliefs and practices of any tradition or system to determine whether they are genuinely serving as a vehicle for personal growth and development or becoming a trap. How amazing is that? I could not have said it any better myself. So I hope you found that useful. This has been a talk on what religion misses about spirituality. In the previous episode, I talked about the materialist view, what that misses. And in the third episode in this series, I'm going to be talking about what modern psychology misses as part of spiritual growth. And we're going to be talking about the practices or the way of life that a person can use as a way to move themselves towards making the unconscious conscious. So thank you. I'll speak to you next time.